Alright, welcome back to another web development video where I show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video, I think this might be something a little bit groundbreaking. In my previous video that I released, it was about CSS Subgrid, and Subgrid is a new specification for CSS Grid layout. Now, Subgrid was supposed to be included as a part of CSS Grid, but they were trying to make sure that they get it right, and they wanted to go ahead and release Subgrid, so they did, or release CSS Grid, so they did that. And then for the past few years, they've been working on implementing Subgrid as a part of CSS Grid as a specification. So Subgrid is actually out now in Firefox. I think it's Firefox 74 or so, and so if you have the latest version of Firefox, then you have the ability to see the subgrid changes. At the time of this recording, no other browser has implemented subgrid yet, but most people expect that to be coming, especially as people begin to use it in Firefox itself. If you watch the previous video, you can see how subgrid works and what the possibilities are. In terms of just using the code, getting it set up, how does it work, and also I showed you how to do a feature query for that, so you could do the @supports and then whatever you're doing, so grid template columns subgrid or grid template rows subgrid, and then so you're checking to see if the browser can actually run that code, and then you put your subgrid code inside that @supports, just like a media query, but it's checking for browser support. So that's one way to implement Subgrid now, and then your Firefox users will be able to see your subgrid changes, and the other the other users won't be able to see those changes. Now, I was sort of racking my brain about how, like why Subgrid? Why is it so important to be able to get Subgrid into the specification? Because I just kept thinking, where in the world am I going to use this? And there was a sort of a use case that was floating around for cards, which is important. So keeping cards the same height while you're using CSS Grid. And I saw another use case for sort of lining up internal elements inside of a card, which those are definitely things that you might run into. But then I started to really think about what Subgrid does. Subgrid allows you to connect a nested element to sort of an outer grid structure. So you have your initial grid, and then you have your child elements, and they are sort of stuck, as it were, to the grid. But then if you had any elements that were grandchildren, so they were inside the child elements, though you just had to create a new grid, and if you wanted it all to sort of look like it was all made on a 12-column grid, you would need to recreate those grids for your nested grids on the inside. And I thought, what's happening here? Like, what are we trying to do? And it was like I couldn't see the forest for the trees. So I was looking, and I was too close. I was looking for some sort of specific use case where we could use this or to solve specific problems. And the reality is that Subgrid is going to change. I think it's going to change everything about the way that we write code. It's going to make everything more semantic. It's going to flatten our code structures, and I'm hoping in this video to be able to show you how that's going to happen. It's a little convoluted and complex, so what you should do, if you haven't already, is to go and I'm going to put a link to the previous video teaching you how to use Subgrid. I think once you see how to use Subgrid, it's sort of like coming at it backwards. Once you see how to use Subgrid, I think this video is going to make a lot more sense to you as to working outward to a larger structure. Now, the only way I know how to show you what I'm talking about is by starting in a design program. So this is Adobe XD, and this is just like Figma, just like so many design programs, even Photoshop or Illustrator, that people use to create web designs. And you know, this is it's a typical like grid-based sort of website, and there's a lot of different elements on here that you can see. You know, we have multiple photos, we have some pieces of text and stuff like that, and it's all laid out on a grid. So if we click on here, and you can see our 12-column layout here. And for a lot of designers, this is where you start. You start with a 12-column layout. It's divisible by 2, 3, 4, 6. So it's a super you can create a lot of complex compositions and layouts with a 12-column grid. So that's typically why designers use a 12-column grid. And you can see that I've laid out the elements according to the grid, right? So you can see, you know, this one takes up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. So that's basically like half the page or half of the grid, right? It's not half of our page because our page width is restricted at this point. So this is maybe it's 1900 pixels wide, but our grid is, I don't know if we have a specific width on here. Can't see what the width is, but it's like 1400 pixels or something like that. So this would be basically simulating like a max width of 1400 pixels on our grid. Now we've aligned everything here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 grid columns wide, and so we have one grid column as a spacer. And same thing here, you know, you got a large 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 columns, but it's centered. So you have 2 column widths on each side, and then this one is pulled over to its right hand edge, only 3 columns wide. And same thing down here. So we've sort of just taken our elements and align them to the grid, and I can show you. So all you have to do is take our elements, and you can pull them off the page, right? Just like this. So each element is not connected to one another because I haven't grouped them together. But these elements are connected inside the space, but they're connected in relation to each other on the grid, but they are not connected to each other in terms of a relationship directly to one another. Okay, I'm trying to explain this the best I can. So you have a single element, you have a single element, a single element, a single element, and then 2 single elements. Now these are all specific sizes. They're taking up specific numbers of columns on the design, but they are not connected in relationship directly to one another. They are just single elements, and they're on the same level essentially, or they're one level under our grid. Okay, so we have our grid sort of underlying all of these elements, but these elements all exist on the same plane. You know, we can take and stack them sort of on top of each other, but they are not bound by anything. We can just, you know, mix and match and move these and make them as many column widths as we want. And essentially we could create this layout without having to create any sort of relational structures on the inside between the elements. All the elements exist on one plane. They exist on one hierarchical level. And what Subgrid allows us to do is to CSS Grid would allow us to create this layout. CSS Subgrid allows us to section our layout. See how we have one section here, one section here, and one section here? It allows us to section our layouts using semantic tags like sections and asides and navigation, and we can actually, and headers and footers, and we can actually section out our layout while still preserving the ability to connect these items to our grid structure. So normally we would have we would have one div or one element that we put CSS Grid on, and then all of the children underneath that would need to be on the same hierarchical level in order to connect to that grid. So they can only be one level deep, which keeps us from being able to have like a grid, and then inside that have a structure of our website using semantic structural elements like headers and footers and sections and articles and things like that. And so we can't have that third layer. We can't do the second and third layer with just CSS Grid. We need Subgrid to be able to connect the third layer, which would be, let's say we wanted to do this. Let's come back to our original layout. So in this section, we wanted this to be header, and then all the things inside of there would be connected to the grid, which we could connect to the grid. I didn't sort of fill that part out because I thought it could be done with these other sections. But let's say this is a hero, or this is some sort of article, or this is some sort of section HTML element. So you would have your grid would be your outer element. Maybe I can show it this way. Before we get into the code, I'm going to show you how it works in the code as well. So we'd have something like our grid, and then we have something like our section. I understand it's capital letters, we don't do that, but I just hit the caps lock. And then inside our section, then we have we have our elements, and so this will be like our image, and then this would be like our text, right? So before, you would need to eliminate this layer because our grid would be here, and the direct child elements would need to be right underneath this. It would need to be in this level of the hierarchy. But because of Subgrid, we can create our grid, our superstructure, a 12-column grid for most people, or whatever it's going to be at your size. Maybe mobile sizes, your developers are developing on a 4-column grid or a 6-column grid or something like that. So at whatever size of screen you're laying out your grid, just like we lay it out here. And then inside of that we have our section element, and then inside of our section element we have this very flat structure. And normally before, we would need to align sort of a super grid, and then this would have to be a subgrid that we're creating, and this would have its own grid structure. But what we really want is we want the sectioning of the website, but we want these elements to act more like they're connected to this grid, but we still like to be able to section off our grid. So we put them here, and we give this element a subgrid for whatever we're using, whether it's columns or rows or both. So if it were columns, if our columns were subgrid, and that was the value, now these elements can relate to these columns. So you can treat these grandchildren as if they were children of this super grid that's on the outside. Therefore, you get essentially what we have here, which is a sectioning out, but it's all connected to this overarching super grid. Hopefully that makes some sense to you. Hopefully that's to me, this is a big revelation. I haven't heard anybody talking about Subgrid being this way. I've only heard them talking about going deeper inside of nested elements and being able to sort of fix problems that are inherent, that are deeper into the hierarchy. But essentially what this does is it allows us to flatten our structure. So now we don't need to connect these two things together. they're connected instead to the grid, and they're free agents to be able to move anywhere we want to. If on a desktop mode we wanted to move them to a whole different section of the actual visual design, we could do that, because it just means it just means that we change their row and their columns, just like you would manipulate them in a program here. But our HTML is going to look like this, and so it can get a little weird and wild, I think, because the same freedom that your designer has is the same freedom that we're going to have in the code. Now, before, if you wanted to manipulate where things were on the entire website, you needed to restructure your HTML. You would have to restructure your HTML. CSS Grid allowed us to manipulate things, especially inside of the little grids that we're making all over the place. But this allows us to actually restructure everything at the super grid level, which is the overarching grid. Now, if you use this with grid template areas, you know, I don't know, maybe the world will explode. I have no idea what will happen, but that's another possibility. So grid is opening up the layout to be more like a canvas sort of element, where you can manipulate things and move it all around. All this is still relative. Nothing is position absolute. So everything is still relative on the page to one another. And that's the other kicker to all this, is that we're not taking anything out of the flow of the document. The document is still going to be like this. Everything that we show on the page is still going to be relative to all of the other elements, and they're going to be position relative, but they're acting like position absolute. And this is position sticky is sort of like it's kind of both, but this is definitely relative, but you can manipulate and move these according to the grid as you see fit. And then if you're adding, you know, margins and things like that, you can actually push it out of the grid structure if you want to. So let's get into the code, and maybe we'll be able to see this a little bit better. So I'm in Firefox, not my normal browser, but this is where it's working right now. Actually, I don't have this set up very well. Let me just get out of my preprocessors here, and we'll just do it vanilla style in this video. I know a lot of people don't. Hopefully my computer will make it. A lot of people don't have a lot of skill or whatever in preprocessing. So let's look at our HTML, and we're going to have a grid. So we're just going to create, I'm just going to create a div with a class of grid. Okay. You're going to see me fumble around with HTML. It's not because I don't know it, it's because I don't write in it very much. And I should use Emmet. Inside of our grid, we're going to have a section. And let's just have a header. And we'll have another section, and we'll have a footer. Okay. So this is a semantic layout for our HTML. So we have a header, we have a section, and this might be sort of a masthead or a navigation or whatever, top bar, whatever you call it at the top of your website. And then this will be your footer, and then a couple of clear sections inside of this layout. So where to start? Let's just make sure that we have some things inside here. Okay, we're going to have something that we're going to call logo, and let's give it an H1 instead. So our logo is going to be logo. Okay, so we have an actual element here on the page. You can notice that it's a grandchild. These are children of the grid, and then this is a grandchild of the grid. Okay, so normally the way that we've done it before, this H1 has no access to this grid if you just use CSS Grid with no subgrid. The only thing that has access to grid are these child elements. Okay, so let's just sort of get that out of the way. We have another element in here, and that's called nav. And inside that nav, we're going to have a UL, and then a list item, and we'll just say 4 list items, and we'll have those. So let's say nav1. And 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so I'm going to show you how this works just with this top header section. Okay, you could give this a name if you wanted to. I don't know, call it masthead. I grew up with newspapers in high school and college, so this is always the masthead to me. So if you're not familiar with that term, it just means all the top section stuff of a newspaper or magazine. So we have our logo, and then we have another element inside here, and that is a nav, and we could call this an actual class of main nav, something like that. And I want to go ahead and structure my navigation just because. So the UL is going to be list style none. I'm really hoping that I don't leave out any punctuation on this. I'm not accustomed to writing semicolons if you've watched some of my other videos, so don't laugh at me. My vanilla CSS is sometimes a little messy. List style padding of 0 and margin of 0. Okay, so this is sort of a typical styling for me, and then we're going to make this a display flex. And I'm going to say we're just going to flex it, and that's what it's going to be. So we're going to flex those items here, and they'll be like a typical navigation. So this will be like a horizontal navigation, and then let's make the list items. That's not what we want. Let's try that again. Control C, Control V, and we'll say our list items are going to be margin. We want them to be to the right side, so we'll put our margin to the left of 1 rem, and that should be fine. It'll just be 16 pixels of margin, so there's no margin here. All the margin is to the left, you can see. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take these elements, and I'll show you what we normally have to do. What we normally have to do is say masthead, and for our masthead we would have to say display grid, and then grid template columns, one we'll say auto, and 1 FR. So normally we would need to do something like this in order to make this happen. What is not right here? Oh, they're not actually inside the header. That's a problem. So let's bring our header down. Like that. Okay. It's important that we actually make them children. So I told you I'm normally doing Pug, which is sort of like SAS. You just have to nest everything and then it creates all the hierarchy for you. So that's where that comes from, and didn't see that. So here we go. This is our header section, and let's go ahead and just sort of section all this out so we can see it. And normally the grid would have a superstructure, and then this would also need to be a grid, just like this, in order to get what we're looking for. And then you know, you would manipulate that. You could do, I don't know, you could do repeat 12 columns and 1 FR, something like that, and then it would create a 12 column grid here. And then we could take our logo and say grid column 2 to 4, something like that. And so it would take up, it would start at grid column 2 and then go until 4, and then we would come down with our main nav. And we would say grid column 7 to 12, something like that. 7 to 12. Something to that effect. So it's going to start it at grid column 7, and then it's going to move on. Let's do a little bit here where we say margin of 0, just to sort of give everything onto the right place here. And for our grid, we're going to align items to the center. And that should line up everything to the center, so we're all on the same plane, centered up. And what else do we need to do? We don't need to do anything else, I don't think. We could say masthead background of just something very light, just so we don't have to change anything else. Okay, and then we could put a little padding of 1 rem and 0. Okay, so we have a little vertical padding. So we've created an actual header or masthead for our website, right? Now this is the way that we've always done it, and the way that we always had to think about this was a section with its own grid, and this was a section with its own grid, and this was a section with its own grid, etc., etc. But using Subgrid, we are actually able to treat these elements here, these two elements, as individual elements, not as nested elements of a second grid, but as actual elements of our top level grid. So that's what I'm going to show you now. So I'm going to erase all the work I've done. We're not changing the HTML structure. Okay, we're not going to change any of this structure. We're only going to manipulate the CSS at this point. So if this is the HTML structure that makes the most sense for your website, then this is the HTML structure that you should use. You can change everything visually now using CSS Grid, and not just change it visually, but connect it to our top level grid. Okay. So let's leave that one, and let's leave that one, and that one. All right, let's change from here down. So we're going to leave all these things because they serve our purposes to still have this structure to our individual elements. Now we need our grid to be a grid, and because our designer used a 12 column grid, that's what we're going to set up. There are 12 equal columns. You could do 12 columns at particular pixels, and then like you can set it up very specifically. So if we go back to our grid and we look, our grid here is 12 columns. The gutter width is 1 rem, 16 pixels. So you can actually set that gap. That would be the grid gap, grid column gap. And then the column width is 122 pixels. So we could actually set 122 pixels exactly for each one, and just do a repeat 12 122 pixels and with a gap of 1 rem. And then this is the margins, so we're not going to worry about that because we're working on a fluid space. We're not working on a fixed space like on this artboard. So that's not necessarily of use to us. We want to know what the internal structure is. So let's just go ahead and set that up. So display grid, and then we say grid template columns, and we'll just do the repeat notation. We'll say 12 at 122 pixels, and then we'll say our grid column gap, because we're not sure about the row gaps yet. So let's just do what we know we have. Grid column gap of 1 rem, which is 16 pixels. And so now we have our super grid, and you can tell nothing is happening here. This is not being taken onto the grid because we haven't set up any sort of subgrid. We haven't connected these items to this grid yet. But now our masthead and these sections down here in the footer, they're all connected. They're child elements of this grid right here. So where should we go next? We should set up our subgrid. I don't like necessarily styling ID, so I'm just going to put a class on here, masthead. You run into some funky issues whenever you start styling IDs. So if you can give it a class, that's a lot easier to deal with and manipulate. So we're going to say masthead, not P. We're going to say masthead display grid. So you start it just like you're starting another subgrid, not a subgrid, but a nested grid. And we would say grid template columns subgrid. Okay, so that's how you write it. That's how you connect whatever's under masthead, whatever is hierarchically under this section or this element is going to take on what's immediately above it. So this is sort of like a go-between. So anything that's here, let's show that a little bigger. Any of this on this level right underneath is going to sort of pass through here and be connected to the grid here. So instead of this one, we have to declare a new grid template columns that would match this. We can just say subgrid, and then it's just like this comes down and takes on this life. So it's going to bring these columns down into this section, except not create its own grid. It's going to allow everything inside the masthead to be able to connect to this top level grid. So now, not only do you have these elements connected to this grid, but you have these elements also still connected to the grid. So the children and the grandchildren are both connected to this top level grid. Okay, so it's like out there kind of stuff. Things that we haven't necessarily had access to before, we have access to now. Let's see if we can refresh this. I don't know what's going on. Okay. Not sure why it didn't refresh when I made those changes, but let's see if it does. Hopefully it doesn't break anything. I'm using the old computer today. My wife has the new one. So, so here we go. We have our grid, and that's in masthead. And then we have our grid template columns as subgrid. And now we're about to see the magic. So we take our logo, and we are going to say, you can see that we don't have any sort of actual grid set up here, right? There's no grid columns, there's no grid rows, there's nothing we can do. And so it's kind of a magic trick. And we say grid column. What do we want to do? We want to, the same thing we did before, let's say 2 to 4. And so it should move our logo to the 2 and 4. Maybe we need that. Let's see. Did we connect everything right? Maybe we didn't. Oh, that was the big reveal. It's like being a magician and you do it and the rabbit doesn't come out of the hat. That's sad. Okay, let's check it out. What do we do wrong? Okay, so we have our grid here. So grid template columns, repeat 12 and 122 pixels. And then here we have our grid template columns as subgrid. Is it that? I think you do have to declare display grid on it. And then we have grid column 2 to 4, maybe grid row of 1. So let's see. Somewhere we're not right. Let's try 100 or 1 FR. I don't know if that manipulates or changes things. It doesn't. So let's say grid row 1. And let's just go ahead and push through, and maybe by doing the main navigation it'll help everything. So our main nav is going to be grid column, what did we say? We said 7 to 12. And then we'll say grid row 1. Okay, so it's taking our grid row 1. It's not taking our grid template columns. But why not? And so maybe for our grid template rows, we need 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. Let's see, repeat. We'll just say auto. See if that helps. It does not help. Grid row, grid column. Let's see. What are we missing? Let me go back and see our previous subgrid and see what we're missing. This one. Okay. So here we can see the subgrid actually in action. And grid column, grid row, grid template columns. I'm just looking to see, you know, did we misspell something, or grid column 2, grid column. So you can see that there's a logo and the nav here. They're children of this masthead, and masthead has this display grid subgrid, and it's taking on the columns up here for app. It looks like everything is right. Let me just check. So masthead is display grid, grid template column subgrid, grid template rows is auto rows, grid column, let's just try it and see if it works with a single number. that's a real fail there. I don't know what that is. Grid is display grid repeat. Well, let's see. I suppose we can just copy just to make sure that we haven't missed anything. So we'll set that there. We'll set that there. You can see that it is taking the rows. So maybe we can say, does this one have a row declared? Yeah. Let's do this. Let's try to declare that on our top level grid and see if that helps. Okay. Definitely not helping. All right, maybe we have some issues here because everything is all on the same level now. So we actually have to do something to manipulate the masthead. I'm hoping this is the issue. So if we come down and we say the masthead should go, the masthead should go all, yes. Okay, so the masthead, all right, this is what happened. All of these elements now are all a part of the same grid. So we cannot think of these elements as different than these elements. And so because I did not declare that masthead should go all the way across all of the columns, it was only taking up the first column, okay, by default. So I needed to actually declare on the masthead that it would take up all 12 columns. So you can see that if I change this or manipulate this, it's actually going to pull everything over, I think. Maybe not. Okay, maybe it won't. But anyway, I had to declare that to be all the way across. We had to declare this to be grid row 1. And then now, essentially all of these elements, even though they're nested inside of here, we can see that these are inside of this. They're actually, in reality, on the page, they're all sort of stacked on top of each other. Because all we have to do is manipulate this one and say grid row 2. And then that would actually move it. This would be row 1, and then it sort of makes an explicit row 2, and this would be row 2 now. And therefore you can take this, also say row 2, and then now even though everything, oh, well, that's not what I expected. Can we do 3? Okay. And then we have grid row 1 and 2 and 3 if we do both. Oh, well, that's an interesting little feature. Okay. Well, I thought you could pull them out like that. Maybe you can't. So maybe you have to have some sort of explicit row structure to be able to do that. The implicit grid won't let you do it. But you can see here that as many columns as we tell it to take up, that's how many it takes up. So this is our, these elements are now individual elements of this grid, okay? Because this masthead, which is, if we get a background, we can see. If we give it a background, we'll see that the masthead is here. These elements are technically nested inside of that background here, but they are beholden to this grid here, just like this masthead is beholden to this grid as well. So that if we wanted the masthead to start at 6, then the masthead would start at 6. So you can see that it's actually on this grid right here, this 12 column grid. And it's somewhat in relation, they're somewhat in relation, because the second you move this grid column over, now this this doesn't stay over here, even though we've declared it to start in column 2. It's starting in column 2 of this element. So there's some limitations basically to what you're doing. If you want to manipulate these internal elements, like the header, the section, the footer, if you want to manipulate those to the page, it's going to manipulate all of the grid inside. I've been using these mostly as ways to section out the page and to let the let robots and assistive technology readers and things like that. I've been letting them use that as a way to say, okay, here's the header of the site, here's the whatever. There's still a lot of work. There's still a lot of cool things, I'm sure, to find out about this, but this is just kind of a revelation that I've come to. But as long as your sections are staying as sections, and they're just taking up, they're holding everything and giving structure to the page, they're not actually a part of the design. You allow the internal elements to be the design process or part of the design. Then you can structure your website better. Otherwise, it would have to be something like this, right? Otherwise, you can just create a website like this without any subgrid, and you would wind up with the same thing because the logo is still beholden to this grid right here. The only difference is that this can act as it can be an ID that you scroll to. It could be just a sectioning off of the document to make it more semantic. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with a bunch of elements, sort of like we have here, where we just have a bunch of elements all over the place, and then we're just sort of mixing and manipulating and matching those elements together. But here you can, if you nest them inside of here, you can still use BEM and do some different things where you have nesting capabilities in your SCSS, so you're able to use pseudo elements, and you're not doing pseudo elements on your top level structure. You're doing it on these sort of component type structures. So you could do masthead UL, you could do masthead UL, in child 3. So you can utilize your pseudo elements on sort of sub elements as opposed to using them on the top level. Because if you have too many elements on the top level, I would think that will mess you up if you have a large application, or if you're using component structures and things like that. So being able to section out, to have sort of a meta layer in between the grid and the grid items, just so that you can do practical things like naming, seems to me like that is an advantageous situation. So you want that meta layer, but before, that meta layer had to actually become a superstructure layer. It couldn't just act as a sort of outside layer that doesn't do anything. It's just there for us to use it and utilize it. So hopefully that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. So what we can do now, because of CSS Subgrid, is we can have sectioning, we can have components, but we can also utilize the actual elements inside those components to the super grid. So this is essentially what we're doing inside of a program like Adobe XD, where we have elements that we can just manipulate whenever we want to manipulate them, wherever we want to manipulate them visually on the page, but the whole time we're keeping the same HTML structure. So I hope to explore this a little bit more, thinking about in an actual design and maybe connecting using Subgrid to how this changes everything, to let's see how it changes everything in action, and let's see what that looks like, and we'll try to work that out maybe in the next video. I hope this was enlightening. It was a big revelation to me, I've been doing web development since 1996, 97. So I've been in it for a long time, and I've had the promise of a lot of things for a long time. And this is the first time that what we used to be able to manipulate in programs like Photoshop is coming to reality inside the code itself. Those two worlds are combining where we don't have to compromise nearly as much as we have always had to. And every year that goes by, we compromise less and less, but some of those are just hacks. It's not built into the code itself. But there has been a commitment through Subgrid and CSS Grid and Flexbox, and also pseudo elements, adding pseudo elements to the selectors, adding those to the CSS as well, so that now you can sort of selectively go through the different elements in your CSS in order to target specific things that don't have specific classes. So it's going to allow this sort of thing to be more common, because what it does is it helps you to flatten your structure. Now you don't have to create classes and subclasses and subclasses and subclasses in order to just target specific elements. You can actually flatten your structure where you have one sort of meta layer, and this is the meta layer in between, and then you have all your elements inside, sort of under those meta layers, so that now you can use naming conventions that make sense and scale, but also have a flat enough structure that you can connect to this overarching sort of grid. I don't know if it's advisable to put the grid on the body or not. That would flatten your structure even more. So we're going one level in from the body. It's assumed in Codepen that this is the body, and then this would be our first element inside the body. So I haven't tried it on the body. Don't know if that's advisable. That maybe that's something that the people who wrote Subgrid could speak to, whether that's a big deal or not. But if you could even remove this layer and just put our super grid onto the body, just like we do the canvas in our programs, right? So this would be essentially the body of our site, and we've just overlaid that grid right onto the canvas to the bottommost layer. So if we could do that, then that also flattens the structure just a little bit. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them. I don't know if anybody cares about this, or if you can even see. I feel like I have vision to be able to see that this is a big deal, and how it will change the way that we write our HTML and our CSS. So hopefully, by flattening our structures and not having a bunch of divs that are separating out our HTML, because we needed that in order to be able to manipulate the CSS like we wanted to. Instead of doing that, maybe now we can come back to a much more flat structure, a flatter structure. When I started, it was a page, and all of the styling was done inside the HTML. And then CSS came along, and then we were able to sort of manipulate and cascade things through the code. But before that, all of our styles were done inside of the HTML, which meant that we had a super flat structure. There wasn't a lot of nesting and things like that were going on inside of there. But what happened was that as we got into CSS, we needed to create layout somehow, and we needed to connect those pieces together somehow. And we didn't have a super grid. We had to create our own sort of grid-like structures in order to do that. And to do that was a lot of divs and separating out individual elements, so that they're sometimes 4, 5, 6 layers deep into the HTML. And I can't imagine that's easy for a robot or for assistive technologies to be able to follow that tree like that. Certainly not nearly as easy as if everything is on the same hierarchical layer. So the closer we can get back to that one level hierarchy and still have the ability to manipulate things with CSS and create layout the way that we want to, I feel like that's bringing together the best of both worlds. And it's sort of a coming back, sort of like static site generators are coming back to the original, and they're helping us do what we know is the right thing to do, what we know is the best way for us to do it, but doing it in a modern way that also allows us to use templating, to use tools that help us to do more efficient things, especially on larger websites. So if this is important to you, leave a comment. Just let me know what you think about it. And I think it's a big deal. Look for the next video. Excuse me, where I'll try to put together a real project, and we'll see how this works in real life, to see if my theory about flattening the structure and bringing everything back into line with a more flat hierarchy in the HTML, but still being able to do crazy cool stuff with the CSS and the layout side. We'll see if that comes to fruition, and if my hunch is right, we should have better HTML structure, more semantic, but also be able to do some wild and crazy stuff on the visual side without changing any of that HTML structure. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. Click the thumbs up button. That's an easy way to pay it forward for me. I want to help people essentially with these videos, and to be able to share what I've been learning. I don't have a blog, so this is my way essentially of blogging. And if you click that like button, it lets YouTube know that this is quality content, that you enjoyed it, that it was something that's valuable for others, and it's a super easy way for you to help me out. Hopefully you've gotten a lot of value, and that's an easy thing for you to do for me. If you want to share it or share it on social media, that would be awesome. And I would love that, because I think this is going to change so many things for the future. So as we begin to adopt this, I think you'll start to see the power and what's been unleashed with Subgrid, and why it's taken so long, and why it's been such a big deal for the working groups, and for Rachel Andrew and Jen Simmons and some of the people working on this. I can see it now for the first time, and I think this is really a shift in modern web design that's going to help everyone. All right, I think that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.